Hey, welcome back. I'm Dave Fisher. We are going through this book, The Story. The Bible is one continuing story of God. We're in chapter 4, so you've probably heard this speech before. But the story is an abridged Bible, so kind of like 1/3, 1/4 of the Bible. But it's actually like Bible text with little interstitials. And the idea of the story is that it's really meant for people who are kind of like doing their first read through the Bible, because the Bible's a little hard, right? And it's also a little bit shorter, so you can kind of get a big picture feel for God's story. And I think it's really, really good. And so we've got a small group where we go through it one chapter at a time. And this video is just kind of a recap of some things that we talked about in our meeting. And I just kind of like to share things, so I just thought I'd put it out there as a video. Lots of different stories that are in this chapter. I say story. Some people think it's like, fairy tales, but I mean stories is just like pieces of information. The first chunk of stories in this chapter is the early years of Moses. That's kind of a joke because the early years are his life 0 through 80. So those of us that are 80 years and younger, we're still in our early years. So by that definition. The story of when he's called by God, the burning bush on Mount Sinai. The plagues, of course, like people know about the plagues. So the 10 plagues, including the final plague, the Passover, the killing of the firstborns, the Exodus, and then, of course, the Red Sea crossing happened very quickly in their journey across the desert. And then this chapter also has a little bit of the pre-Sinai desert travel information. So some things we can learn from God with his people there. So that's kind of the information that's in chapter 4 here, and we're going to go through some of that together. One of the things I like to do is I like to always have a verse of the day. So this verse, I'm not saying it's a joke, but it's just kind of like almost like an opposite verse. Maybe we should just read it. So the punchline is, but he said, "Oh my Lord," I should tell you where this is found. This is Moses on Mount Sinai. He's 80 years old at this point. He left Egypt at 40. He's been a shepherd of sheep, right? So for Jethro's flocks for 40 years, right? So it's just kind of who he is. Very, I imagine laid back by this point in his life, and finds the burning bush. And God calls him to go back to Egypt and serve as like his prophet, the prophet of God, to free his people. And his response is, I'm not a very good speaker. Please send somebody else, right? And the reason that I picked this as the verse of the day is because it, meets me where I am, I guess I would say. So, not super confident whenever God met him. His confidence in God grows greatly over time. But his confidence, especially in himself, to be able to do these things was very low, right? And so God saw a lot more in him than he did. He saw his future, I guess you would say, of being the great people of Israel, their leader. And so the thing it tells us about God is that God works through people. So that is how God rolls. It's how the Bible's written. Whenever he talks about like doing the miracles, even he says like, tell Aaron to stretch his hands out over the water. Tell Aaron to take his staff and strike the ground, right? So like he works through people, and so God works through people, and so he worked through Moses, and Moses was the person he chose to be a part of his story. I also think it's interesting that these words were written like in the Bible by Moses. He's not only the primary character, he's also the author of this, and so he wrote this about himself. And what a tribute to him to like share his weakness, so we could learn and feel comfort in this. And like he wrote this like at a time when he was leading 2 million people across the desert, sometimes in circles, and to be able to be open and to share that, like he really pointed to God in his life. So it's just really kind of a good verse there. A couple different videos that we could watch to start these things. There's like the official video, which are always very good, and then there's the Maryland video. That's the church that I go to with Scott Longyear. Then there's the Bible Project videos. The one that we watch as a small group, and I'm not going to play it here, is this one right here in the Bible Project. There's a couple different versions of this video. This one's not the newest, but this is the one that I like the best. So we watched this together, 6 minutes, to try to get your head around what was going on in Exodus here. That was not useful. I'll go back to the slides. So we'll skip it for this video, but you could there's a link to the slides below this. You can find this slide and you can watch these things. I'm going to pause the official video there. One of the little screenshots that I stole from that video we watched was about how God knew that Pharaoh was going to resist, and he still gave him many chances. So that's why there's many plagues, not just one plague. And so the question that kind of the group answered was, how can we apply it to our lives? So like we can know that God gives us so many chances, and we can forgive people, and we can make that choice ourselves. And then we asked what other verses people kind of thought of with this, and one of the first answers was when Jesus was talking, and somebody asked him, "How many times should I forgive my brother?" And he says, not 70 times, or 7 times, but 70 times 70 times, right? And so, like, you shouldn't stop forgiving people. Other ones people mentioned as being patient with Peter. So Peter was the rock of the church, right? And so he denied Jesus 3 times, and Jesus knew he was gonna, but God works with people and works with imperfect people, and so gives us just chances, which is good to know. Then the story also shows that there's chances and there's chances and there's chances, and then there's also the judgment, which is another thing to know about God. We'll get to that later. Big picture. So one of the goals of this book is to think about the big picture of the upper story. So we get like focused on the details of these lower stories. I myself am like chief guilty of that. But the idea of the story is that it's short enough that you can like keep your head around like the upper story, like big picture and where we're at. So just to kind of recap, so obviously started with man together, dwelled with people. The fall, sin as a part of the world, got so bad had to reset things. So with the flood, promised to not do it again. God began forming his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And then, of course, Joseph and the people going to Egypt with Joseph to avoid the famine. And what we did as a group, and then now we're ready for when it's time to come out of Egypt, right? And then what we did as a group is we actually thought from God's perspective a little bit. And so there was a problem, right? So the problem spoken here by the Lord is like, I've seen the misery of the people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out. I'm concerned for their suffering. And so what he did is he decided to come down, and we see the story of the plagues, and he chose to work with people. So I'm sending you, right? It's like work with people to help bring about resolution here. This, by the way, was not like a response to a problem by God. It's like, oh no, I'm backed up against a wall. What am I going to do here? I don't even know what to do. This was the plan, right? So this is God speaking to Abram 200 years earlier. And he said, know for certain that for 400 years, your descendants will be as strangers in a country not their own. And they will be enslaved and mistreated. I will punish the nations they serve. They will come out with great possessions. These prophecies we see fulfilled in this chapter. And then it also says 4 generations of your descendants will come back here. So people lived a lot longer back then, which is a whole nother discussion. But Moses himself lived to be 120. And so what we did as a group is we can see God had a plan. We can see that God had a problem and God solved a problem. But just for fun, as a thought experiment, what we did is we met as a group, and we kind of did a traditional engineering exercise. I don't know if people have ever done this, but we sat down and we thought about what were the problems that God had. So people had to move to Egypt. They were going to die in the Promised Land, right? In year 2 of a 7-year famine. The famine was over in 5 years, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of ways that God could have fixed the lower story problems that we had. And then obviously the problem was they became slaves in Egypt and persecuted to the point of killing the male children, right? So lots of problems that needed solving. And so thinking from God's perspective, this is the problem that you've got to solve. And I think he makes this plan before the world began, right? So it's not like he solves it that afternoon. But what were his options that he could have used as his next step? And what were the metrics that he would have used to evaluate which plan was a good plan, right? And so that was kind of the exercise we went through. And so just to kind of make you understand how the process is going to work, First, you brainstorm for a while, so you kind of need a group to brainstorm. And then you put your top few choices into the matrix. So I put some ridiculous ones in here. So stay longer, leave in year 5, so like right the day the famine ended, go back. Send aliens, words in the sky. And so you come up with your different options that you think would be good options. And then you come up with metrics for like, how are you going to decide if this is a good idea or not? It's like, how easy would it be for God? Or how impressive would it be to have God do this? Would it save lives? Would it save the lives of the people? And then just kind of an example of a bad metric. How funny is it, right? So, and then the way a design decision matrix works is you score each one, like 1 to 5, 1 being stay longer, not so funny, right? Sending aliens, hey, that's kind of funny, right? And so you score them 1 to 5, and then you do the math. You can weight these metrics if you want. Not going to go into that, but that's how design decision matrix works. So here you can see that saving lives was way more important than one of the others. So you do math. You do 7 times 3, you get 21. You add up the row. This row comes to 28. You see whose score is the best, and then you take that one as the winner. So with this metrics, God should have sent aliens, right? So not a very good design decision matrix there. So what we did together is we used Post-it notes individually to come up with ideas, stick them on a board. Then I went up and I kind of organized the common ones to come up with ideas. I could probably get a picture in here of what we did together. And then we sat down and came up with metrics as well. I'm going to get banned for showing photos there. And so like this was some of our ideas. So like some of ours were take control and start God's kingdom like in Egypt, right? Change Pharaoh's heart. And then another was, of course, to do plagues. And then, so those were some of the metrics that we came up with. Some of the ones that I have listed in the slide deck here. So you could, you can go through and read them. I won't necessarily read them all to you. But, things were like Joseph is king, right? Things where they take over in Egypt. Things where Pharaoh changes his mind. Sending the Messiah now was an idea, right? So many options, right? And then after you pick like the different options, you say like, how will we decide if this was a good idea? So like, will it convert Egyptians? Will it last? Will it glorify God? Will we be able to learn about God? Will it save lives? Are kind of some ones we threw out there. And so, oops, I guess I lost my slideshow. And so after you brainstorm ideas, you brainstorm the metrics that could be used. So here's some metrics. Would it grow the nation? Would it help Egypt leave their gods? Would it help God's people survive? I think a big one that came out is understanding God's nature better, giving second chances, being in control, acting as a judge, and taking action. And so preparing a nation for a new leader, I think was a good one as well. So you can go through and you can score these and you can decide which one is best. Now we do this as a fictitious, silly exercise, but the point is that we're created in God's image, right? And so God is a very creative being. He considers different ideas. He evaluates which one would be the choice that he would make. I would love to see if God were to make a design decision matrix for me, what his thoughts would be. I think it's better for me to think about it, right? But you can kind of see like some pros and cons of this one that we fleshed out here. God's plan was way better than some of these other plans, and it also means that like the things that God does are done for a reason, and it takes time to understand the reason for us. It takes time for us to understand the culture. But they're done for a reason. Like there was a reason frogs came. It's like, that's kind of weird, right? There was a reason that the more dramatic plagues came at the end, right? And so that was how we started our small group, is kind of talking about those next steps. Other videos that I think are really good. This one is another Tim Mackey video. We won't watch the whole thing here, but I'll just kind of point you to it. But he talks about how God works through people, with people. He doesn't just give salvation from the sky, dropped in parachutes, right? Like he's down in the dirt with us, and the Exodus and learning these messages is going to be messy, and they're going to be hard for some people, and I myself am one of them, especially that 10th plague, and trying to understand God's perspective of why he does all these things. And then there's also the question of why use Moses. That has two parts. Is why use people, because you don't really need people to send plagues. why pick Moses? Like, what did he bring to the table? And then, what are some pros and cons of big miracle plagues? They actually can cause unbelief for people that weren't there to see them, right? Hopefully it caused belief in people that saw them, but it can actually be problematic for people, which is interesting. And then why go to Mount Sinai? What was the goal for that? So Moses, got kicked out of Egypt, got saved by Egyptians, which is kind of an interesting way to start his life. Went to Mount Sinai, and then he's bringing the people to Mount Sinai, which is we're going to learn about next week, right? So great video to watch is like Tim Mackey in his early years, which is fun. I'll skip over here. And then what I do every time for these is I kind of have some boilerplate slides that I go through. We look at the timeline, we look at the locations, we look at the characters, we look at the authors. It's just always good to have a little bit of process in these. So chapter 4 of the story comes from Exodus chapters 1 through 17. The scientifically believed time period is 1500s BC. There's a lot in this slide deck about dates and specific sciencey things. We'll get to those. But the plague in the Red Sea crossing, the current proposal is that those things happened in 1446 BC, and we'll look at some thoughts about that. This is during a period in Egypt that's called the New Kingdom, the 18th dynasty. It's kind of what we're talking about here. Who is the author of these books? So this is part of the first 5 books of the Bibles, the Pentateuch. So its authorship is accredited to Moses. Obviously, there were some edits by scribes and other prophets over the years, but the author is Moses. This quote up here in the top actually comes from this chapter, Exodus 17, which is the final Bible chapter that chapter 4 comes from. Is when the Lord says to Moses, write this on a scroll. It's something to be remembered. I didn't notice it in the book, but it was from, it's like the transition between this chapter and next. And so it's kind of interesting. The first reference to the Bible, about the Bible in the Bible, is here. Obviously, it was edited by other people. So, for example, they talk about the land of Ramesses or leaving from the city of Ramesses. Ramesses was born 200 years later, right? So this definitely has been edited by people. It's clearly not called Ramesses at the time, but I appreciate it. It helps us know what they're talking about, that somebody edited and updated city names for us. Wish they'd kind of done that more, to be honest. Characters, Moses, obviously. A little angry here, about to throw a tablet down. Moses' brother Aaron, so his slightly older brother, 3-year older brother Aaron. These two were brothers of Aram, don't know how to say it, and Jochebed. And so they also had a daughter as well that we know of, Miriam, who was the oldest of the 3. So she was the 7-year-old sister. She's the one who, when Jochebed put Moses in a basket in the river, you know the story, found by Pharaoh's daughter, and then Miriam comes up and says, would you like for me to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby for you? So that's Miriam. And she travels with them throughout, which is cool. There's obviously the Pharaoh's daughter when Moses was a baby. Lots of guesses about who that was. I put in here Mutnefret as one of the possible options for who that could have been. And then, 80 years later, different Pharaoh. So not this Pharaoh's daughter and Pharaoh are not the same, right? So, the guess is 1446. I put in the name. That'd be Thutmose III. So we'll talk about science fun. Locations for where these things happen. So the plagues, the meeting with Pharaoh, happen in the city of Tanis, which is the plains of Zoan. Obviously, all these things are contested, but I'm just trying to get you a big picture of what we're talking about here. The Hyksos capital was Avaris, which was really close to Tanis, all essentially the same place. Avaris is right on top of where the Israelites went whenever they were sent to the land of Goshen. So this whole region is called Goshen, right? So home to the Hebrews, home to the Israelites here, and Avaris, which was the Hyksos capital, and then later renamed Pi-Ramses, right? And some people say Pi-Ramses was a couple miles away, but they're all basically the same area. That's the space we're talking about here. Other land places to know about, Midian. So Moses, when he leaves Egypt, so he's 40 years old, he leaves Egypt. By the way, the idea is that you've already read chapter 4. I'm not meaning to tell you about chapter 4, but you've already read it, and we're kind of trying to add more information to it. Midian's over in Saudi Arabia, so crossed all the way across the Sinai Peninsula to Midian. Nobody really contests where Midian's at. Some people argue about where Mount Sinai is at, though. So Mount Sinai, it's not really known, right? Is the best way to say it. So there's a lot of data that like helps us try to find and pick Mount Sinai. So, for example, obviously the Israelites walked there. I've kind of drawn them walking across the Red Sea at that location. And it is, a sensible route. So you follow the coast, you find the river, you follow the river up, you end up at this location. So this is a reasonable spot for Mount Sinai, right? Other things is Aaron met Moses on the mountain of God. So Aaron would have had to have walked there, right? Moses first found it when he was tending flocks for Jethro, his father-in-law. And so he was walking pretty far, right? So that's why some people say it's like, oh, it's over here, right? The Amalekites defended this land. So they, I forgot, it starts with an R. Rehoboam? No, not Rehoboam. They came and attacked the Israelites at that location. And so it's like, would they have actually protected land that far away? Elijah went there. So there's all these things that give us information about where Mount Sinai was. And so no surprise, there's been dozens of proposals for which one is Mount Sinai. Just to clarify, in like 400 AD, that's when they kind of thought it was this mountain, which is Jebel Musa. And so it was so popular in like 400 AD that they, I think, did rename it to Mount Sinai. But that's not really known. That's what they believed in 400 AD. So you can still change your mind about it if you want. There's a lot of good things that point to that. Other mountains, just to kind of point to them. So this one right here, number 2, Mount Shinbishar. This was actually like in Zondervan, who's the author of the story, right? So Zondervan, the author of the publisher of the New Testament. I shouldn't say author, publisher of the New Testament. NIV Bible, the whole Bible. They published an atlas, and the author of that says, it's here, right? That's kind of an interesting thing. Now, that made sense because they were always talking about like a 3-day walk, and that kind of closer to a 3-day walk, right? So that one's popular as another alternative. If you look on the internet now, there's a bunch of, I don't want to call them tourist companies, but people really pushing you towards this one over here, Jebel Alaz, that's in Saudi Arabia. They're like the real Mount Sinai. I don't want to badmouth it too much because, when I get to heaven, they may turn out to be right? So I don't want to say too much bad, but I'll say that, that was proposed recently. They've got like really impressive, like the rock that Moses split in two. They've got this amazing rock. They've got this huge beach where they could have left from, and it's like really impressive. They find chariot wheels in the water. I'll say that of all the options, that's about the only one that personally I feel like I could just rule out. So like Exodus 18 says that Jethro, so this is his father-in-law, came to visit him when he was in the wilderness near the mountain of God. And then when he left, Moses sent him on his way and said, return to your home country. But like these two places are like 10 miles apart, right? So like of all the different claims, that's like one of the only ones I feel like I can rule out. So so at any rate, doesn't really matter which one is Mount Sinai. I have certainly no reason to believe anything other than what they decided in 400 AD. Mount Sinai, right here as far as I'm concerned. Move on with my life with that information. Tons of possible routes, even if you consider that to be the location of Mount Sinai that they took. Where did they choose to cross over the water, the Red Sea at, right? So there's different theories for that. Almost all the routes have some crazy loops in them, especially afterwards. I think it's funny that like afterwards people draw crazy loops because they think they found some of these places. But in the first part, when we don't have any information, they pick a very sensible route. So it's like, is the first route too sensible? So this is obviously what chapter 4 is, and then chapter 5 is going to be at Mount Sinai, and then chapter 6 is going to be wanderings, so the loops, right? So those are the places we're talking about. And then, of course, you can kind of see Jerusalem, Jericho, those places back up here. So the early years, Moses, born, put in a river in a basket, 40 years old, kills an Egyptian. There's people that are trying to kill him, so he runs away. Runs pretty far away, by the way, so it must have been a serious accusation, right? Like he didn't mess around. He left for reals. And so some questions to the group that we had is, do you think Moses was qualified to lead his people? I mean, he certainly didn't, but God did, right? And so he felt like he wasn't a good speaker. it's funny, if he'd been really reflective, he probably would have said that his anger was the biggest problem, right? Because he got angry, right? It was like, I'm too easily angered, should have been what he said. But he said he wasn't a very good speaker, which was probably true, right? And wanted him to choose somebody else. God did permit him to have Aaron come with him, which is great. But there definitely were a lot of talents that Moses brought. He was also familiar with the desert, which is good for somebody that's going to lead the Israelites for 40 years in the desert. I mean, he walked around enough to find Mount Sinai. He was born in the palace, familiar with kind of like palace etiquette, knew how to not get them killed and to actually gain audience with Pharaoh, some of the customs there. And so he was the choice, right? And then he became very confident in God as he continued his life. Before we jump into the story too deep, I also kind of wanted to back up and say, leaving chapter 3, there were 70. Starting chapter 4, there's 2 million, right? So what happened from 70 people to 2 million people? And so they were very fruitful. So you can kind of see that there's some amazing things happening in God's plan to make the people so fruitful during their time in Egypt. Yes, the slavery was a problem, but they actually were a nation now instead of a family. And so they definitely had a mindset for growth. You can actually see it to like they had laws like if you died and you didn't have any children, then your brother had to marry your wife, right? And then have children for you so as to continue your name. So you can see that like it was critically important, this whole like continuing of your name. And like this law about your wife marrying your brother, this is like an insurance policy, like to make sure if you die young, then your name will still be carried on. And so it was definitely good for growth, but it definitely could be carried too far to make it seem like that's your only purpose, right? And so I'm sure that there were definitely some mothers who felt that drive very strongly. But so it could be good and bad. The math of is this even possible, right? To go from 70 to 2 million. The math says that, yeah, it's possible, right? So that's the thing about exponential growth. So population in millions over years. If you have 10 kids per mom and greater than average life expectancies, how big would you get? If you had 8, if you had 6, if you had 4.5, not that hard. I bet a bunch of them were pretty high. And so there must have actually been some population control, which we see from the Israelite leaders, for them to not get bigger with their mindset and their safety that came from living under the umbrella of Egypt. So kind of interesting. By the way, there's perceived to be only about 2.5 million people in Egypt, and there's like 2.5 million Israelites. Like they were a big group of people, and they were crazy densely populated for that time period as well, right? I will also give a disclaimer here. So 20 years ago, there was science around the Exodus, so like not even that long ago. It's like 2000. And it was different. Like they claimed different years, and they had different ideas. There were movies called like the Exodus that had like Ramesses as the Pharaoh. And in 20 years from now, there will probably be new evidence. I mean, that's how science works. I find it the beauty of science is as soon as you have new evidence, you change your mind about things, right? And so that's perfectly valid. That's perfectly accepted. And in 200 years, it'll be even different. I suspect that, we'll find Joseph's name, his Egyptian name somewhere, and then that'll change people's minds. I doubt we find much about Mount Sinai just because I think that one's kind of already run its course of facts. But just kind of know that things will change. And it's important to think about the culture to understand the Bible, because you're observing a story that's not written to you. And it's important to know the culture and to understand what's going on so that you can get God's message from the author. But specifics of it didn't matter which Pharaoh it was. It didn't matter which dynasty it was. It has almost nothing to do with the story. But people still love to explore it. And I myself find it fun and interesting because I like history, right? So let's just kind of talk a little bit about history some. So just kind of get your head around things. So Egypt, it had good periods. It had bad periods. So good periods are when the central government was strong. Arts were prolific. Drawings, masterpieces were commonplace. And then they had periods where things were not going as good. Like nobody could get along, civil war problems, less art, less culture developments. And so they call the good times the Middle Kingdom, the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. So a bunch of pyramids in the Old Kingdom, so a long time ago. Middle Kingdom is when Joseph entered Egypt. So the Israelites entered in this year. Joseph, what was it, 22 years before. The Israelites were there through the second intermediate period with the current proposals, through the Hyksos reign, and the intermediate periods. You'll notice that like the dynasties are numbered, so 11, 12, 13. And then there begin to be like two dynasties, right? And so like, why are there two? Like 15 and 16 were simultaneous. And that's because like 15 reigned in Lower Egypt, and then 16 reigned in Central or Northern Egypt. Like you can see that things weren't going well. They had multiple simultaneous dynasties, right? Survived the intermediate period. Moses is born actually once the New Kingdom started. And then the Israelites leave in the middle of the New Kingdom is the proposal here. So 430 years that they were in Egypt. Lots of theories about their exact departure time have been proposed. These are from Constable's notes. I think it's interesting. I will say that the range of guesses is getting like tighter, like a tighter bounce. Like it used to be like, it's like, oh, maybe it was Ramesses 200 years this way. It's like, maybe it was, Amos is like 200 years this way. And now we're kind of like getting smaller in the science of this thing. So his was that it was most likely Thutmose the first. And I think that the current proposal is Thutmose the third. So just kind of interesting there. The intermediate period, just to kind of understand it, was a time of a divided Egypt. And so in the north, it was ruled by the Hyksos, which were not even Egyptians. So these were Aztec traders who became the pharaohs of Lower Egypt. By the way, Lower Egypt is in the north, Upper Egypt is in the south. That's because the Nile flows this way, right? So Lower Egypt flows that way, right? Really confusing that Lower is in the north, but that's how it works. So the Hyksos were in the Lower Egypt. The actual like traditional Egyptian dynasty was in the central area, centered with the capital around Thebes. And then at the time, the southern area was under Nubian control, which is just powerful landowners, right? So they didn't really have a pharaoh or anything. They were just controlled by powerful landowners. Eventually, the central dynasty, the smallest of the circles here, will win out. They'll take over the north and Lower Egypt first, and then they'll take over the south later in the time of Thutmose III, right? The Hyksos, I think, are a really interesting group. This is the 15th dynasty. So you can see that they started the Hyksos reign right here. So they're an interesting group because they took over Egypt without, I wanted to say without firing a gun, right? Obviously they didn't fire guns. Without stabbing anybody, right? Without cutting any heads off. They took over Egypt because it was really just a neglected region, that there was no strong power, and they just became the power, right? So they dubbed themselves Pharaoh. They took on Egyptian roles, right? They didn't like take it over for the Levant or anything. They took Egyptian roles. They became pharaohs. They wore headdresses, right? And so they took over. They established their capital at Avaris. They were over the Israelites. There's some phrases in the Bible where it talks about that they've become too numerous for us, and if war breaks out, they'll join our enemies. And it kind of seems to fit that a Hyksos ruler would have been the one who said this, right? And so I think that the Egyptians were over the Israelites for a lot of years, right? So certainly by this time, 1650, so 200 years before the Exodus, they had become slaves. I don't know when it turned, right? So they were probably pretty good up till Joseph died. There's like 150 years there. I'm not sure how it was going, but they definitely became slaves for the second half of their time there, is my guess, based on history and words like if war breaks out. So I think that these verses in Exodus were written well before the next paragraph in Exodus, which is interesting. The Hyksos, if you read the history of the Egyptians, they're kind of vilified as like, outsiders and immigrants who are dirty people, right? But really, that was just they got vilified by the people that eventually went out. But they were just traders, right? In fact, they brought in crazy technology. So they brought the chariot to Egypt, right? That was the Hyksos that did this. They brought in the composite bow, which could shoot 3 times farther, so 1,000 feet. They had improved iron weapons, axe and the sickle sword, right? And so, like, the Hyksos did a ton for Egypt. to get like vilified as evil people from other lands, right? So that was the Hyksos, and they definitely weren't necessarily great either, but that's kind of interesting. The 18th dynasty, that's the central Egyptian kingdom. They dominated. They won in 1550 BC. Amos the first was the one who was in the central kingdom and took over, right? So took over the north. And then when they took over, you see the message change. All sons must be thrown into the river, let all daughters live. So they were also happy to be slave masters. And it kind of seems like the Hyksos had this plan to have the midwives kill the children, which didn't really work. And then the Egyptians, when they took over, they had the plan of throwing them into the river, which obviously had more of an impact because Jochebed was scared enough about it to put Moses in the river, right? So it just kind of is an interesting way to see how history can affect your reading of the Bible. Not entirely sure it's accurate, but it kind of is fun to think about. They talk about the Pharaoh's daughter. Here I wrote princess, but Pharaoh's daughter rescuing Moses. There's a thought with this proposed timeline of the 1446 Exodus that it would have probably been a daughter of Amos. He had three that it could have been. Some people say it was Hatshepsut, who was a later emperor. We'll talk about her some later. But she, with this proposal, would have been born 17 years later, so would have been hard for it to have been her. The one that I like is Monofret. You could read more about her if you want. Her title was King's Daughter, and it says Pharaoh's Daughter. All three were called Pharaoh's Daughter, but I just kind of liked picking her out of the group. Not a lot of data behind that, but that's just kind of my thoughts. The direct math year for 1446, you can see that falls in the reign of Thutmose III, and so you can evaluate whether that is what you think science says as well. It doesn't really matter what you think science says. Doesn't impact the story, but it's fun to think about. People have obviously suggested others: Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Amenhotep II. Basically, every pharaoh of the 18th dynasty was suggested. One important thing to mention: some people say, well, the pharaoh had to die in the Red Sea. It doesn't actually say that, right? So it says, the waters returned, covered the chariots and horsemen. Of all the hosts that Pharaoh followed them into the sea, none of them remained. So of the people that went into the sea. So people think that Pharaoh had to die. That isn't what it says, right? So it could have easily been somebody in the middle of their reign, and that would have been the case, which is the case with the current 1446 proposal of Thutmose III. Little thing about the Pharaoh's daughter thing here, if you want to read more about hers, and who my pick is, right? So kind of my which one I think it was. Other people say when they think about pharaohs that it actually makes more sense for it to have been a Hyksos pharaoh. The reason for that argument is that there's nothing. This is important to know. There's nothing written about these plagues in the record books, right? And so they kept records, right? So I mean, this guy Thutmose III, he traveled with a scribe, right? His yearly military campaigns are all recorded. How many slaves he took is recorded. It's we got 82 people this time. We got 155 this time, right? They kept records. But there's no records of the firstborns of Israel dying. There's no record of 3 days of darkness. There's no record of these things. And obviously people use that to point out that the Bible is a lie, right? And so some people prefer to say it happened in the Hyksos period, who were conquered by the Central, and then history just got lost, right? Is kind of is one of the answers. That doesn't really work out mathematically, right? So if you like the 1876 entry, it'd mean they were only there for 320 years or so. The Bible's pretty clear. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, which is interesting. I'm not quite sure how that phrase was put in there. Obviously, Moses wrote it, and so did Moses hear it from God? It's kind of interesting to think. So the Hyksos one, you'd have to change the entry date as well to believe that one. The other thing I'll say is entering in a Hyksos reign would mean you were in Canaan at a time where it was no good to be in Canaan. So Thutmose III led, I think some say 14, some say 17 campaigns through the Levant. I think he led 17, but 14 were to the Levant. Some were to South Egypt, right? Sorry, South Egypt meaning Upper Egypt. So at any rate, he was a ruthless, ruthless dude. Like, he's the guy that, when you think of Egypt, like, he's usually the guy you're thinking of, right? So led the chariots, so came in with hundreds of chariots. One of his more famous battles, this is when he first became Pharaoh. Like, his first order of business was to take a campaign north and conquer these areas. Had a famous battle at Midigo, so they had to go around Mount Carmel. The date of the battle at Mount Carmel is recorded. The information about the siege is recorded. The number of people killed. It's interesting, like, how many were killed on both sides. Obviously, it's recorded by them, so who knows the exact accuracy. So, the message I was making is it would have been bad to have been there in that time period. So, you can kind of see from 1446, they controlled it. And then 1406, there was less control. Ramesses would come back and exert some control later, but it would have been bad to have been there. I think that Thutmose III is a very reasonable proposal. Other things that kind of that point information that way. So this is somebody's website. There's the link of the list of his campaigns. So year 22 of his rule is when he actually became Pharaoh. His not his mom, his stepmom, sorry, I can't say her name. Maybe I'll look at Hatshepsut was ruling for him. You can see that their years start the same. She kind of started off as as a regent helping out because he was the Pharaoh. And then after 7 years, she said, I'm the Pharaoh, which is interesting. Really interesting character in history. She was the second female Pharaoh. There was a time many years ago where it was the sister of Pharaoh took charge because there was no male heirs, right? But here there is a male heir. And she dubbed herself Pharaoh. Really interesting character. Wore Pharaoh's beard, dressed as a man, like took on a male role. Had a wife, right? So it's definitely as a champion for like the transgender movement, right? So this was 3,000 years ago, Pharaoh, right there. Right? That's an interesting person in history. Anyway, love tangents, but it was year 22 of his reign when he actually took reign. Every year he would do campaigns, so he would go these different places, and this is just kind of like a summary. Year 24, year 25, essentially like it was an annual thing that he did. Here was a 3-year campaign, which this historian records that they lost. I'm not sure how they figured that out because he would have never written down that he lost anything. 29, 30, 31, and then there's a missing year here, so no campaign in 32, but every other year is accounted for. So his reign had a campaign every year except for 32, which is kind of interesting. What year is missing? To do the math, it's kind of fun. His reign began in 1479. Subtract 32 years, which is how BC math works. As you go forward, you get smaller. 1445, which is 1 year after 1446. So there was no campaign in 1445. And obviously this is one of the reasons people pick this date, right? So, why was there no campaign that year? It's like, you might ask the Red Sea, right? So, definitely, a lot of people have submitted this date, for reasons like this. Other reasons, submitted. So his firstborn son, was Amenhotep, who was the son of the great wife, not a minor, wife. So, was the son of the great wife. So, Satia was her name. And so he was going to be Pharaoh, right? He was considered to be a god by the Egyptian people. So God Amenemhap, right? So that's who we're talking about here. He was the one who we believe died. He died between 1445 and 1444, which hits that time period as well. You can see that there's a lot of things that point to this date for this. There's, in all fairness, there's a lot of pharaohs who lost their first son, right? It just happened a lot in that time of history. But this combined with the real evidence was Joseph driving out the wealthy landowners in the time of Senusret III in 1876, 430 years. That's where these proposals come from. So I just kind of wanted to share that. Not that important. People say it's like, well, why didn't it get recorded if he was so good at recording information? He was also well known for falsifying history, right? So the 18th dynasty, well known to vilify the Hyksos. Thutmose III, also an interesting story. Like 20 years after she died, so not like when she died, he tried to erase Hatshepsut's like image from all the walls. It was very blatantly done. You weren't going to get away with it. Like, you can go look at these walls and it's like huge mural with like 7 scratched out people. All right, it's like, who's the scratched out person? It actually draws attention to her, not erases her. And so definitely was very aware of the significance of history. He did it probably, hard to say why. Some people say it's because she was female. I think it was more because he wanted to kind of erase her bloodline, because his son, Amenhotep, the one that lived, Amenhotep II, was not of her bloodline at all. I think it was just to help strengthen him as all. I don't think he had anything against her personally. I don't personally think it's because she's female, but nobody asked me. I don't really know. But important thing here is didn't mind erasing history. Definitely was aware of how history was important. So that's the timeline that people have proposed. Looking into it, I think it seems pretty good. Is the science going to change in 20 years? You bet. Will it matter? Doesn't matter, right? But it's funny to like think through specifics once you pick years, right? So like, Moses would have been in the palace through this time period in history. His mom, if it was really Monophet, not mom, but the one who took him out of the river, was the mother of Thutmose II, and how would that have played in? He would have been there when Hatshepsut married Thutmose II. He would have left before they had a daughter who was not Thutmose III. And then it's also interesting, like, when Moses came back, it says, those who wanted to kill you are dead. Who were they talking about? It's like, well, if you look at the dates, it was probably Hatshepsut herself, right? So why did Hatshepsut want to kill Moses? Who knows? Really interesting, easy to get engaged in. Doesn't affect the story. I think I've done plenty of damage to you, getting you too deep in that path. But I find it really interesting. Back to the story that actually is important. So, Moses. Moses was called by God. The way he was called by God was the burning bush at the top of Mount Sinai. So taking the sheep around, or goats, I don't really know, ended up on Mount Sinai, saw the burning bush, one burning up, came over to talk to God. And so the question here, we didn't get to this in the group, is God uses people. We talked about this earlier with Moses striking the ground. And that's how God does things with us, right? So he meets us where we're at. He moves us from where we're at today to the direction he wants us to go. So don't be surprised if God does things through people and through you, right? So this is kind of something to be aware of, right? So how's God planning to use you? After being called on the burning bush, met up with Aaron, who came to him, essentially at the mountain. He went back, dropped off the wife. Just got permission from Jethro to go. Met up with Aaron, and then they came back, and in starts the stories of the plagues, which are really interesting as well. The first thing I'll say is that that was not the next slide I was expecting. So the plagues are not like for us. So if we find the plagues confusing, that's because we have a different culture than what the Egyptians had. And so the 10 plagues, so this video just kind of goes through them pretty quickly. We'll go through them as well. They all have more significance to the culture than they do to us. And the big thing is that who was Egypt, right? Like, who were they as a people? Who do they worship as gods? How they live their lives? And why might these crazy plagues have made sense to them? So we know that God doesn't do things randomly. So we need to try to figure out the message that God's sending by understanding the culture some, right? So the main proposal here is that they were directly related to gods, the Egyptian gods, which comes from the Bible, right? So he says, I think it's on the next slide, that he'll attack their gods as well. And so each plague, whether it's frogs or flies or boils or hair, is related to, and it's hard for us to map them exactly, an Egyptian god, to show God's power, that it's him who is in charge of all things, not this god, not that god, not that god. It's to give Pharaoh many times, many opportunities to come around. And these gods, just to kind of like learn more about them, there's a lot. So people list over 1,000 different gods. And they had shrines in their homes. They had temples. Each one kind of had its own like thing it was in charge of. Again, the mindset was more that like flowers don't bloom. Flowers grow because of a god's moving it, right? The sun doesn't move overhead. Ra moves the sun, right? So everything is done by God. There's no thought that there is no God. There's no thought that natural processes drive things like we believe today. It's all about gods, and these are the different gods. And so these plagues were directly related to these. And I think I had the quote somewhere in here. Oh yeah, here it is. I'll bring judgment against the gods of Egypt, right? So God makes it clear, these are words, that I am the Lord, that this is in fact the plan. I'm not going to take time to go through this in detail, but water turned to blood. There was a god of the Nile, so it showed that he was in charge of the Nile. But by the way, there's the whole question of, was it actually blood or was it actually just red from like sulfur content? Doesn't matter to me that much. I think it probably wasn't blood personally, but it doesn't affect my belief in God. I just think they didn't have a better word for describing it. It was a thick red liquid, right? It was like thick red liquid, blood, right? But I don't really know the details, is what I'll say. Frogs, there was a frog god, right, of all the different things. Pekek is how I hear from some people pronounce it. And so the frogs came up, was meaningful to them. Gnats, which also some people use the word lice. I like the word gnats better than lice. Related to sin. Flies right after the gnats. Livestock. By the way, today we look at like, could these have come from natural causes? And we consider that to be like evidence that there is no God. So like, is it possible that the Nile could turn red, right? Is it possible that the sulfuric buildup had been so great that over the years it turned the river red? I'll say to that it doesn't matter to me is the honest answer, because if it was like natural consequences, it was God who directed it. Just kind of like, I don't mind evolution just as long as you accept that God was driving it, right? So could it have turned red on its own? Seems a little suspicious, but it was obviously done by God one way or another, right? Could it have been that frogs got out of the river because it was turned to red liquid? Sure, they could have got out in the river. Could it be that there were a bunch of dead frogs and that brought about the gnats? And then the flies and the gnats are really one and the same, right? So people like these natural stories. And then all the flies kill cows through disease. We see boils later. And so I'll say that people definitely fight these for, like, it was natural occurrence, just something you should be aware of. But when it comes to 9 and 10, I think we kind of lose the could have happened naturally, right? So the next one at any rate was boils, which was believed to be related to Sekhmet or a couple of the other gods. There's so many that they overlap, right, is really the idea. Hail, burning hail. I've never really understood how hail is burning, but it definitely says like fire from heaven, not just like what I think of as hail. So hail with fire somehow. Don't really get the details there, but I could look into it more, I'm sure. Locust, this one I've kind of experienced in the Midwest. Like I've seen some pretty crazy locusts, and when the cicada get really loud, like it's like a scary sound, right? I can imagine that sound times 100, and like it would have been like super scary to have been there. So like we're getting serious about these plagues, right? And then the first one that just kind of defies any sort of science is 72 hours of darkness, right? So how do you do 72 hours of darkness? And so this one is where we kind of stop saying, oh, it could have been natural, right? It could have just been Red River. And we have really just two options for this one. Either you believe it didn't happen, which is where honestly the majority of the world is, or you say that God made it happen, and the reason God made it happen is their primary God was Ra, the sun god, right? I mean, he was the guy, right? And so this plague is actually the least destructive out of the plagues, but its place at number 9, like I think 1 was pretty important, and then maybe 9 after that, was just to show that, hey, there's no way this can happen except through God. And by the way, it wasn't the whole world. It was regional darkness. Like even the Israelites in Goshen had light, right? So it wasn't a global thing. And you could say it was thick clouds or something like that. But this is a 72-hour, 3-day period of darkness to show that it was not Ra who ran the sun, it was God who ran the sun, right? Is what this message is. Each time, go to Pharaoh. Each time he says, "I'll let you go if you stop it." They bring back the light, and this time, just like all the others, they get told, "I've changed my mind now that the tragedy's gone." And then they kick out Moses and Aaron. They say, "You won't see us again." And then the 10th plague comes. Definitely the most significant by far, right? And it's an act of judgment which I struggle with understanding and like, because it's crazy harsh, right? So it's the firstborn, and it says in some interpretations, firstborn son. So firstborn son throughout all of Egypt. So it affected every household. So every household had somebody die. And it's interesting. There's another slide about this. It's interesting to look at judgments that you've seen from God in the Bibles already. So Adam and Eve judged and have to leave. That one's not that bad. The judgment on the whole world to flood it. That one, like, people don't even consider it bad because it's kind of like, I don't know, like, it wasn't personal, right? And like, it wasn't that big a deal. But obviously it was. Like, these people drowned in a flood. So there's a judgment there. Tower of Babel scattering the people. Sodom and Gomorrah. But again, it was like the whole town. This is the first time where, like, mothers are separated from their sons, right? Like, I like to really think about that this was just, right? And so it was just. God did it, right? So it was a mighty act of judgment, and it was directly connected to what the Egyptian pharaohs decided to do in throwing the boys into the Nile of the Israelites. It's directly connected to Jesus saving the Israelites through the spreading of blood on the door path. And so there's just a lot of really significant things here. Definitely think it happened. Definitely think it was extreme. Definitely think it was just. But it's definitely a harder topic to see judgment. And again, the other thing you see about judgment is it didn't happen on the first day. It wasn't like they sinned one time. I mean, this was 430 years that they were with these people. And I mean, there was every opportunity to learn about the Israelites. There was every opportunity to learn about their God. There's every opportunity to change. And by the way, there is evidence in the Bible that some people did it. It lists, like, when they exited, there were 600,000 men on foot, women and children, and then some others that went with them, right? And so the others, they obviously weren't Israelites because they would have been listed in the earlier groups. There must have been some Egyptians that chose to come, right? So they obviously lived through the plague, and so it's just really interesting to think about these things, like, and they're significant, and they're directly connected to Jesus. So there's no missing the symbolism here, right? So you take the blood of a lamb, you spread it on your door, and the destroyer will go over yours, right? So that's how you'll be saved, right? And so the name Lamb of God, not a mistake, right? Direct connection here to something that happened 1,500 years earlier. We didn't get to ask people this, but the parallels that you can draw and talk about salvation through the blood, redemption through the blood is really interesting. So just kind of sharing that for you to think about. The question of these are big miracles. It feels like we don't see big miracles like these this days. It's like, I've been alive for 40 years. I haven't seen one yet, right? So God still performs miracles today. They often come smaller, at least in my life, with very opportune things happening at very opportune times. You can see them, but you've got to think about life from a perspective to where you can see them, right? So it's just kind of interesting. But I've definitely experienced them in my life. Nothing at this scale, but I've experienced miracles many times in my life, up to and including this morning, right? Other interesting things about this story. So Pharaoh's heart. I feel like I should say more about this morning, but I don't know if I should or not. But so think about more things there. So Pharaoh's heart is what we're talking about. So Pharaoh's heart is interesting in the Bible. So the first 5 plagues, they talk about how Pharaoh hardened his own heart, how his heart became hard, how his heart was unyielding. And then the next few, the next four, it says the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. The Lord hardened. The Lord hardened. Hail is apparently the only one where they didn't need a push from the Lord. And that switch is significant. And the switch is kind of unusual. So a big part of life, a big part of God, a big part of Adam and Eden in the garden is that God gives you choice, right? So He lets you make up your own choices. But this suggests that the Lord had something to do with taking away choice from this Pharaoh, right? And so He hardened his heart. And again, the reason being that he had a bigger message to tell. And also it means that he'd already judged this Pharaoh. He didn't smite him down. He didn't die this day. If it was in fact Thutmose III, he lived for many years after this and was crazy worldly successful after this. So he didn't take away all his choices, but he had a message that he needed to share. And so he hardened Pharaoh's heart. I'm sure there are, but I can't think of many other times in the Bible where God has chosen to mess with free choice. But this was definitely one of those times because there was a bigger message at play here. So once this plague is complete, they leave. So he, that very night, gets up and tells them to start packing, and they go in a hurry, right? So they leave with 600,000 people, right? I'm sure it wasn't that fast, but they left as fast as they could. Other people went with them, so some some Egyptians came to believe. They took livestock and flocks with them, right? So they traveled heavy, right? They traveled around following the pillar of cloud by day and pillar of fire by night, which is God was very directly involved as they begin this journey. They get led to Pi Hahiroth, which on this map is a dead end, right? So I'm not saying that this map was correct, but the concept is there. Like, at what point do you get really worried about Moses' sanity when you're led to? It's like, hey, we got to go that way. I was like, where are we going, right? And so we lead them to a dead end, and then you find out more that God's told him that He's going to harden Pharaoh's heart, so he will pursue you. Like the Egyptian army was really fierce. It's fun to look up their weaponry of the composite bows and then the axes. There's some documentaries that you should watch about Egyptians, and like the idea of chariots, like one person driving and one person shooting, iron tipped arrows from the back. Like, it would have been scary, right? And so like we're walking into a dead end, and now we've told Pharaoh to come after you. And the reason is to gain glory through himself, through Pharaoh and his armies. So the miracle at the Red Sea, again, it's a very creative solution to what was an obvious problem. People changed their mind, right? So like somebody with a huge arsenal army just let a million people go. They're gonna come after you at some point, right? So it happens sooner rather than later. God hardens his heart, so it happens sooner. And we see the miracle of the Red Sea crossing. So parted the waters, walked across. Army went in. Army is drowned. God doesn't make the Israelites fight. Would have caused a tremendous number of casualties. And so that's how a very obvious lower story problem was resolved. That's how God showed His mighty hand to the Egyptians as well, the ones that didn't come with the Israelites. And so it was obviously necessary and a tremendous story from the Bible to learn about judgment and to see how creative God is in problem solving. Once through the Red Sea, so they kind of had a little detour there to take care of that problem. They're off to Mount Sinai. So Mount Sinai, this is a picture of Jabal Musa, so it's the main proposal of which one was Mount Sinai. Crazy, rugged looking area there in that picture. Along the way, lots of things. Like Moses tried his very best to record everywhere they went, like the name of the town, the things that happened there, the name of the region. Described it with like how many palm trees and oasis there were. Like he probably thought he was doing a really good job of keeping this journal. We have no idea where these places are, right? Like we've got our best guesses here, but you can see like even this proposal, every one of them's got like a question mark beside it, right? Because we don't know. Our Rephidim, that was the word I was trying to think of earlier. That's where the Amalekites came and attacked them, which is really far away, right? Which is one of the weaknesses of this Mount Sinai. But at any rate, this was a story of when he had to purify the water. A story of when they avoided disease. So he actually asked the Israelites to do something, which is interesting. Time in the desert of sin. This is where manna started. So manna ran for 40 years. So God had to feed these people. There's information about quails in there. Really active time for God showing himself to his people and all the challenges they have. It would have been hard to have been in the desert. Happy to let other people do it and let me learn about it. Drawing water from the rock at Horibum, I don't know how to say it. And then also one of my favorite things, first reference to the Bible in the Bible, the Lord said to Moses, write this on a scroll as something to remember. And so this was after their battle with the Amalekites, which was not in the story. All right, so talked for way too long. I really enjoyed it. You made it this far in the video, which shocks me, but I really enjoyed you getting to be here. And so the big picture is we are starting an adventure with the Israelites that we've been on for a while, admittedly, as a big nation group, part of God's plan. We've got another 1,000 years of history ahead of us, just to kind of share that's in the Old Testament. And we're going to see the ups and downs of these people within the desert, and when they get to the Promised Land, and as they try to control it, as they continue to struggle. And I think that, spoiler alert here, so the big picture is God works with us, but we kind of learned that as people, we're not going to make it on our own. And so definitely gives us every opportunity, but we definitely see by the end of the 1,000 years effort, we need Jesus, right? It's really what it comes down to. And so lots of interesting things still ahead in the Bible. So that's kind of it for the important things in here. We'll see you in chapter 5. If you go look at the slides, there's a few other slides here, but there's really nothing worth showing in the video. So thanks so much for coming. We will see you next time. Go read chapter 5, learn about the covenant that was made at Mount Sinai, and we'll see you in the next video. That's it. Bye.